And ever since the end of the Vietnam War, let's say 75, the United States got out in 73, the war ended in 75. Ever since then, the United States has been trying to get rid of this sickness, to get rid of the Vietnam syndrome. In other words, Vietnam gave war a bad name. And the idea was, we must give war a good name again. And so this, as you call it, Bush War One. I like that. Bush War One. Okay. We're going to try to stop it at 2, right? We're not going to have more than 2, I hope. But when Bush War One was finished, I distinctly remember Bush getting up before television cameras and saying, and this is almost his exact words, probably the most poetic statement he ever uttered. He said, "The specter of Vietnam is buried forever in the sands of the Arabian Peninsula." That's pretty good, huh?
That's what he said.
The specter of Vietnam buried forever. That's what they're hoping.
Yeah.
They're hoping that people will not think about Vietnam. Do you know what they want people to think about? They want people to think about World War II. They want, because World War II, I mean, here we go into the history you're talking about. World War I gave war a bad name. World War I was the war that after, even people who had supported the war, after World War I, they said, what in the world were we doing? 10 million men died on the battlefields in World War I. And at the end of it, nobody knew why the war was fought. So, and you know, after the World War I, Hemingway, Dos Passos, other writers were writing, you know, All Quiet on the Western Front, all of that. So war had a bad name. World War II gave war a good name. Hitler, fighting against fascism, and so on. And then Vietnam comes along, gives war a bad name. So what do we have to do now if we want to fight another war? We don't want people to think about Vietnam. By we, I mean the administration. I don't like to really say we, but no, we don't want people to think about Vietnam. We want them to think about World War II, the good war. Skip Vietnam. In fact, if you go and see what kids are learning in the schools, they're not learning much about Vietnam. And the movies that they're showing on television and so on, a lot of them are about the heroism of World War II. D-Day, the 101st Airborne, Saving Private Ryan. And the whole idea, I believe, is to take the good war and connect it with all these bad, ugly wars that we have been fighting recently. I think that's the idea. It means, you know, they're trying to obliterate a piece of history. They're trying to obliterate Vietnam.
Well, I mean, not to mention Korea, and as Gore Vidal talks about the 200 other armed conflicts that we've been involved in between now and then.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Korea is like the forgotten war. I mean, people know very little about the Korean War. It's like came and went, although it lasted 3 years, and we don't know, maybe 3 million people died, almost all Koreans. I mean, 56,000 Americans died, but about 3 million Koreans died, but it's like a, you know, it's forgotten.
Yeah, well, the book I read said 4.5 million, 3/4 civilian died in Korea.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, either way, 3 million, 4.5, you can't even get your mind around it. It's so horrible.
It's interesting. When you get into those numbers, it's interesting how, oh, 1 million here, 1 million, it's amazing, isn't it? You know, what's 1 million people? 3 million? Of course, it doesn't really matter. Huge, huge number of people.
Well, that's the thing that really breaks my heart about what's... I can't really dignify it by calling it a war, because you have to have two sides combating each other. But let's say this recent bombing campaign. I know that one of the things that I read that you said, you quoted Colin Powell, who said that in the first, as we say, Bush War I, they asked him, you know, how many American dead, and he had a figure, and then they asked him how many Iraqi dead, and he says, that's not something I'm terribly interested in. And I wonder, is that mentality, I mean, I understand that from a military man or even from our government, but is that mentality kind of pervading our whole culture, all of the people in our society, do you think?
I don't believe that people naturally don't care about other people dying. I mean, I think Americans, if they hear about other people dying, they care about it, but they're not told about it. They're not given any. Well, just like you said about Colin Powell, he's not interested in that. The Pentagon never gave out figures on how many Iraqis, how many people died in Iraq, how many people died in Afghanistan, how many people died in the first Gulf War, which is what Colin Powell was talking about at that time. The government, the Pentagon doesn't tell people about it. The newspapers don't tell people about it. I distinctly remember that exactly when the first Gulf War ended, I mean, that very week in 1991, I was in an airport and I picked up actually, I confess I didn't pick up copies. Well, I picked them up, but I didn't buy them. You know, the airport, you go in, you pick up something, you read it, right? You don't pay for it. And so I didn't want to pay for news and Newsweek and Time, but I wanted to. The big, you know, the front cover was victory, great victory, you know. But I was interested. I looked through each one. I had time, and my plane wasn't coming. I had time to look through Time and Newsweek, about 100 pages in each on the war. I looked to see if they had any report on how many Iraqi casualties there were. And there was nothing, nothing. So with that, you know, what you're saying, it's not a surprise that the American people are simply not aware. It's like these people are invisible. But I feel that the job of our job, I don't know, the people who are concerned in the world, the job is to make invisible people visible, you know. And you know, when I think of invisibility, you know, I think back to Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. I think black people being invisible. And what happened in the South was that the black people who created the movement in the South and suddenly created a commotion in the country, they made black people visible to the country. And before that, in a certain sense, to white people in the country, black people were invisible. And I think today with the war, I think we have the same problem. We have to make visible these other human beings who are dying. Americans die, and other people die. And I think, you know, I think American people are normally, naturally compassionate people. It's just that the media and the government don't tell them anything about that.
Well, you know, on the subject of the media, you know, obviously it's been very anesthetized and cleaned up, and even what used to be a fairly progressive channel, CNN, once it was sold by Turner, it has become another mouth, you know, the party speak still, you know. And so I wonder, like in England at least, even though that has a government I would not necessarily approve of, and their foreign policy is kind of we're the child of their foreign policy, so it's not surprising. Like, you know, I know when the Pilgrims first came over, they started doing the same shit that they'd learned from their government, which is we're gonna you know, burn their crops and rape and kill and pillage and take their land. But at least in England, you have The Guardian, and you have some progressive media where those people in England, there's no way Tony Blair is going to be re-elected because he did something. They know what's going on. They also saw the pictures of the BBC